1. The creepiest mall encounter of my life. I was 13, sitting in the mall food court with a friend, when a random guy complimented my hat. He walked away for a bit, then suddenly came back and slammed $2 on our table. "You guys look bored," he said. He wasn't wrong, so we took the money and went to the arcade with him. He showed off his skills on Dance Revolution, clearly trying to impress us. At some point, we exchanged Facebooks, and ages he was almost 10 years older than me. Huge red flag now, but back then, I was a naive emo kid, and to me, an adult with a studded vest and cigarettes seemed ridiculously cool. Back at the food court, he started bragging about his MMA career, flexing his beer gut like he was some kind of champion. Then I mentioned Black Veil Brides, my favorite band at the time, and suddenly, he claimed he personally knew Andy Biersack and hung out with him whenever he was in town. When I brought up blood on the dance floor, he doubled down, saying he had once been roommates with Darby Vanity, the infamous lead singer and convicted predator, even though he mispronounced his name the entire time. I already suspected he was completely full of it, but stupidly, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. A few weeks later, we hung out again, this time with more of my friends. This is when things took a turn for the worse. He started getting way too touchy with the girls and wanted hugs, groping, whispering creepy things in their ears. He'd even flirt with them while snapping a whip whenever we were in the back of Spencer's. The worst part, he had a woman who actually hung out with us sometimes, as if everything was normal. At this point, I was creeped out, but at least the guys in our group were safe. That is, until we met the gay vampire. About 3 to 4 months in, he casually dropped the bombshell that he had multiple personalities, to normal straight guys, and then a vampire. Yes, you read that right. This vampire persona came with hissing, a terrible fake accent, and absolutely no concept of personal space. Imagine a bloated Nosferatu with a neckbeard. While he wasn't as bad with the guys, no one escaped the damn whip. This charade lasted about a month and a half. Then, one day, the vampire personality disappeared, maybe out of sheer embarrassment, because we never saw it again. After that, our visits to the mall became less frequent. Then, he got banned for 6 months after getting into an argument with a mall cop. The last time I ever saw him, he gave my friend a bag of spicer mix of random herbs, sprayed with whatever psychoactive chemical was legal at the time. For some reason, he refused to buy alcohol for us since we were underage. But apparently, a bag of potentially lethal mystery drugs was completely fine. We smoked it later in the woods, and things went south fast. One of our friends went to use the bathroom in a CVS and never came out. 15 minutes later, a staff member found her standing frozen by the door, her arm extended toward the handle, pants around her ankles, completely unresponsive. She was lucky to leave in a stretcher and not a body bag. That was the last time I ever saw him. My friends cut ties immediately. From what I've heard, his mum still drives him to the mall, and he still hangs around the arcade to this day. Story 2. The voice in my son's room. A few years ago, after my divorce, I moved back to my family's farm with my 2 young boys, ages 2 and 4. The house was huge, surrounded by fields of produce, and at first, they loved it so much space compared to our cramped little apartment in Orlando. But after some time, their excitement faded. They started saying things like, "There are monsters upstairs," and eventually, they refused to be alone in the house. I noticed small, strange things here and there, but over time, I just got used to them. Looking back, I wonder if they were seeing something that I wasn't. After 2 years, I met a great man. We took things slow, going on casual dates, and he got along really well with my boys. He genuinely wanted to spend time with us, even if it meant just sitting around the house. One night, after my mum and the boys were asleep, we decided to sit outside and talk. Since my kids were alone in the house, I left my phone on speaker, connected to his phone via mute, just in case they woke up and needed me. Hours passed as we talked, and we were about to call it a night, when something froze us in place. A man's voice came through the phone. It was coming from inside my bedroom. We couldn't make out exactly what he was saying, but there was no doubt he was talking to my son, and my son was responding to him. A cold chill ran down my spine. We burst into the house, sprinting down the hall. When we reached the bedroom, we found them both sound asleep. The room was silent, completely empty. Even after all these years, I can't stop thinking about it. Who the hell was speaking to? My child, story 3. My grandmother versus the Night Stalker. My grandmother is, without a doubt, one of the most incredible women I've ever known. I know everyone says that about their grandparents, but seriously, she's a force of nature. While most people her age slow down and take it easy, she refuses to sit still for even a second. If there's the slightest hint of sunshine, she's outside, tending to her garden. If the weather doesn't cooperate, she's inside, straightening things up even when there's nothing to straighten. I drop by a few times a week to check on her, but the truth is, she ends up checking on me. She forces me to eat whatever delicious pastries she's been baking and then bombards me with questions. Am I still in school? Have I met any nice young ladies? Do I have a job? Do I enjoy that job? And oh, can you believe this weather? The visits are always the same, predictable and warm. That is, until one particular afternoon when her neighbor nudged her and said, "Go on, tell him about the guy." My grandma frowned slightly. "Which guy? The guy in your garden?" At that, she let out a small sigh, as if the story wasn't worth telling at all. "Oh, right. There was a man in my garden yesterday." I paused mid-bite, assuming he was a city worker or someone from the neighborhood association. But before I could ask, her neighbor cut in with a grin. "Oh," and she whacked him with a rake. I nearly choked. "You did what?" "Hit him with a rake. A good, solid smack, too." My grandmother looked positively pleased with herself. "Grandma, you can't just attack people for being in your garden." "Well," she said matter-of-factly, "if he didn't want to be hit, then he shouldn't have climbed over my fence." I looked between the two old ladies, both nodding solemnly, as if I was the one who didn't understand the basic rules of society. "Why was he even climbing over your fence?" I asked, bewildered. She simply shrugged, as if that was the least important part of the story, as if it was just another afternoon for her. I managed to piece together the details through the back and forth between her and the neighbor. Apparently, some man had hopped the fence into her backyard. Instead of panicking or calling the police like a normal person, she had grabbed the nearest weapon and started swinging. Eventually, the man fled, probably not expecting to get beaten by an old lady wielding a gardening tool. At the time, it seemed like a bizarre but harmless incident. A weird story to laugh about. I left that day with a pocket full of pastries and a reminder that my grandma was not to be messed with. And then, a few months later, something terrifying started happening in the area. A series of brutal attacks had everyone on edge. Women were being assaulted, some disappearing altogether. The media dubbed the perpetrator the Night Stalker, and his reign of terror made people check over their shoulders every time the sun went down. Everyone was scared. Everyone, except my grandmother. She waved off my concerns, laughing at the idea of extra security. No matter how much I tried to make her understand the severity of the situation, she refused to take it seriously. She told me I was worrying too much, and for a while, I thought she was being reckless. But then they caught him. The Night Stalker was finally in custody. His face was everywhere: newspapers, TV broadcasts, online reports. I was sitting in my grandmother's living room one evening when his mugshot flashed on the screen. My stomach turned at the sight of his cold, dead eyes staring back at me. And then casually, as if she were commenting on the weather, my grandmother glanced up and said, "Oh, that's the man who climbed over my fence." I snapped my head toward her. "What?" She sighed, closing her book and looking at me as if I were the slow one. I said, "That's the man who climbed over my fence. The one I whacked with the rake." I stared at her in horror. "Grandma, that's the Night Stalker, the guy responsible for all those attacks." She just nodded. "Yes, I heard them saying that. HMPH. If I'd known, I would have hit him a few more times." And with that, she went back to her reading. Just like that, no reflection, no fear, no concern that she had come face to face with one of the most dangerous criminals in recent history. To her, it was just another day. To this day, she still shrugs it off like it was nothing. But every time I think about it, I shudder. Because if he had climbed into anyone else's yard that day, that story might have had a very different ending. Story 4. The Trucker in the Dark. There's nothing quite as peaceful as an open road at dusk. The stereo humming softly, and miles of highways stretching ahead. I was driving through the back roads of Sonoma County, my son asleep in the back seat, stretched out across the seat despite knowing he shouldn't. But honestly, I wasn't going to wake him up just to make him sit up properly. It had been a long drive, and we were making good progress. The sun was fading, giving way to the slow creep of night. It was that golden moment of transition, the brief handshake between day and darkness. I hadn't passed another car in what felt like forever. So when I finally saw a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror, I barely gave it a second thought. It was just another traveler, suffering through the same lonely stretch of road. They gained on me quickly. No problem. Out here, there were plenty of opportunities to pass. I wasn't in a hurry, and I certainly wasn't about to play games with some impatient driver. As the truck loomed closer, its headlights flashed once. Then again, I frowned. That was odd. Was something wrong with my car? I loosened my grip on the wheel, letting the car glide smoothly forward. No strange vibrations, no pulling to one side. Everything felt fine. Still, I tapped my brakes just to check and saw the truck's headlights reflect back in response. Another flash. I waved them on, making it very clear that they could pass any time. But they didn't. They just stayed there, close enough to make me uncomfortable, but never moving past. My unease grew. Something wasn't right. I slowed down, indicating that I was pulling off the road, and to my absolute dread, the truck did the same. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We were alone. No other cars, no houses, just me, my son, and this stranger behind us. I parked and took a deep breath, trying to calm the growing panic. Maybe it was just a good Samaritan. Maybe they really thought something was wrong with my car. I stepped out, keeping one hand on the door handle, just in case. The truck's engine rumbled as the driver door swung open. A man climbed down Toll Broad, wearing dark glasses and a cap pulled low over his face. He had the look of every trucker stereotype I'd ever seen. except something about him felt off. In his right hand, he was holding a tire iron. A chill ran down my spine. I glanced at my car. Nothing looked wrong. Everything was intact. So why was he holding that? My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I forced myself to stay calm. My fingers tightened on the car door, ready to bolt inside if needed. The man was close now, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel. Then, just as he was about to reach me, he stopped. His expression flickered hesitation, uncertainty. His eyes darted past me, toward my car. My stomach dropped. I turned my head just enough to see what he was looking at. Pressed against the back windshield was my son's sleepy little face. I didn't hesitate. I yanked the car door open, ready to throw myself inside if needed. The trucker exhaled sharply through his nose, shifting the tire iron in his grip. Then, in a voice that was completely uninterested, he muttered, "Thought you had a flat." He gestured lazily toward my car. I flinched. The moment stretched on for too long. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, climbing back into his truck. A second later, the engine roared to life. I watched, my body frozen in place, as he pulled onto the road and sped off, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, shaking. Nothing had happened, and yet, something almost had. I climbed back into the car, buckled my son in properly, and pulled back onto the highway, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I kept checking my rearview mirror for miles, making sure I wasn't being followed. By the time we reached the next town, the night felt less suffocating. My nerves settled. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe the guy really had just been trying to help. The next morning, everything seemed fine, until I opened the newspaper. There, on the front page, was his face. I nearly dropped my coffee. It was an artist's sketchhand, official police rendering of the wanted man, a killer suspected in the deaths of 2 women. Women he had lured by pretending to help with car trouble. My stomach twisted into a knot as I stared at the familiar features, the weathered face, the dark glasses, the same dead-eyed expression. If my son hadn't woken up at that exact moment, if he hadn't seen that I wasn't alone, I might have never made it to that next town. Story 5. The stranger at my door. 2 days before Christmas. At 4:30 a.m., I was startled awake by a loud banging on my front door. Not a knock, not the doorbell, just pounding. For context, I was home alone with my young son. My older son, who was visiting from university, had been out with friends and hadn't come home yet. My first thought, as any paranoid mother would have, was that something had happened to him. Maybe the police were at my door with bad news. I rushed to the door, still in my underwear, and peered through the spy hole. There was a man standing outside, talking to someone behind him, then turning back toward me. "Don't worry, don't panic," he said. And just like that, I immediately started to worry and panic. He was dressed in regular clothes, but so are plainclothes officers, and something about him felt off. He looked like he didn't belong in my neighborhood. I asked if something had happened to my son, but he ignored my question. "Don't worry, just open the door," he said. I told him to hold on while I grabbed my dressing gown, stepping away from the door for a moment to calm myself down. But just as I did, I heard him mutter something, I don't remember what, only that it was odd and unsettling. That was when I started coming to my senses. It was 4:30 a.m. A total stranger was at my door. My mind was racing. Something wasn't right. I returned and demanded to see his ID. He pulled something from his wallet, pressing it against the spy hole. but I couldn't make it out. For a split second, I considered opening the door with the chain to get a better look. Then he spoke again. With an eerily calm Australian accent, he said, "I just want to hang out. Can I come in?" My blood ran cold. That was the moment it clicked. I went from fear to pure rage, screaming every curse word I could think of, telling him to get the hell away from my house. The next day, something terrifying occurred to me. Had I been wearing pajamas that night instead of just my underwear, I probably would have opened the door to a complete stranger who was planning to do God knows what.